Hello guys, and welcome back to my video. So in this video we are continuing with our job board application, right? So this is second from last episode. So in this you are going to be working on the user profile, right? We're going to be working on getting the user profile and also editing the user profile, right? So without wasting much of the time, let's start writing. So the first thing that you need to do is, if we go inside our features folder, right? So let's go inside our features folder. Let's create another folder called user profile. Okay, so let's create another folder called repository. And then let's create another one called controller. And then let's create another one, which is going to be a widgets folder. And then let's create the last one, which is going to be screen. Okay, so on the user repository, let's create a file. Just name user underscore profile, user underscore repository. Like that. Okay, so what I'm just going to do is I'm simply going to minimize, and then yeah, let's begin. So let's just create a class we're just going to name it user repository. Okay, so let's just create a variable local auth repository, because our user repository is going to have two dependencies. Class that's going to depend on, it's going to depend on the local auth repository, so it's going to depend on the HTTP client. It's going to be underscore client, right? So what I'm simply going to do is let's just import the library HTTP with prefix HTTP, right? So now what we are simply going to do is we are simply going to bind our local auth repository and HTTP to our construct. Then we're simply going to do something HTTP client package, right? Then we're simply going to set our local auth repository to our local auth repository, and then our client. Okay, so we're getting an error saying okay, we're supposed to use HTTP client, right? All right, so now that we are done, what we simply need to do is we'll simply create a method for retrieving our user data, right? So this method is going to be of type future. And then we're going to use HTTP, our either from fp.package, right? To just represent where that will allow us to take care of two separate states. Like for example, if we have like here from our backend, and then when we can get the user data, the user model that we created in the first video, right? So we are going to just name this method get user data. Then it's going to have a parameter. The parameter is going to be user ID, because we are going to be getting the user data by the user's ID, right? Right, so now what we simply need to do here is we simply need to import failure, and then we also need to import the fp package, right? Okay, so now the other thing that we need to do is we need to create a request headers, right? So for our request headers, content type, which is going to be application /JSON, right? And then we also have authorization, right? We also have authorization. So our authorization, we are going to use the DF token. And then we'll simply have to pass in our token. We're going to get it from local auth repository, get user token. Okay. So now what we are simply going to do now is we are simply going to create a URL. And then we'll use HTTP, and then we provide the base URL, which is appconfig.base URL. And then we'll also provide the user's URL, which is going to be appconfig.users URL. All right. And then let's get a response. I'm going to get a response from our server. So we will await the response, and then we'll send a GET request. And then we'll then pass in the URL, and then we'll also pass in the request headers, right? And then also get the data, which we are simply going to decode from our body. So JSON decode response.body. Right, so now what we simply have to do here is let's just import that convert, right? And then what we simply do here is we'll simply create a try catch block, right? So if there's any errors, potentially if there are any errors, what we simply do is we are going to catch those errors, right? And then what we're simply going to do here is we are going to check our response, right? Our response dot status code is equal to 200. That means that our response is successful. We are simply going to turn right from our fp dat, and then we are simply going to get user model from JSON, and then we'll simply pass in our data, right? And then else, that means if we don't get a successful response, what is simply going to return left, and then we'll pass in a failure, and our message, which is going to come from our data, we simply define the message from our backend, the message from our backend, right? All right, so now we are done. What we simply need to do here is simply have to just handle the error. So it's going to be a failure, and the message is simply going to come from e.toString, right? e.toString, that's going to be the message, right? And then now what we are simply going to do is we are simply going to handle update user information, right? So let's create another method for updating the user data. So it's going to be also a feature method. So what we simply do is I'll simply copy this method right here, copy, and then I'll simply paste it just below. And then here what we need is we'll simply change to update user data. And then we'll change this. We are not returning the user model, we'll just change success, right? Success response, right? And then basically what we are simply going to do here is we need a profile image, right? Profile image, and then need the first name, and then last name, and then also need the user ID. Okay, so here we made a mistake. We are supposed to also add user ID here. Also, we are retrieving the user data using the user ID, right? So here the request data is fine, and then what we are simply going to do here is the URL is also fine. So let's just get rid of interpolation, and then what we are simply going to do is because we are going to be sending, we have images, so we are going to be sending them by HTTP multipart, right? So we're simply going to get rid of this, right? So simply going to create a request. So let's just leave the URL, and then let's get rid of this. Then we're simply going to create a request. So that request is going to be http dot multipart request, right? So we need the method. The method is going to be a page request, right? And then we pass in the URL. And then to pass in the URL, we are going to use URI.pass. And then we are simply going to pass in the URL.toString method. Okay. And then what we're simply going to do is we're going to add the files to our HTTP multipart, right? Request.files and then .add. And then what we're simply going to do is create HTTP multipart. So I was going to say HTTP dot multipart file. Multipart file dot going to come from path. So what I simply have to do here is quick fix and then import library, and then from path, and then the path is going to be profile image. then here what we are simply going to do is we are going to find image path. So let's check, let's import the file, right, .io, all right. And then we need to add a header to our multi-part request, right? So dot headers, and then dot add all, and then we're simply going to add the request headers, right? And then we also have fields that we also need to add. So the first field is going to be first name, which is going to be equal to our first name from our string. Second one is going to be last name. Okay, so also I have last name. And then also I have username. Okay, so what you simply have to do here is let's add the username. Okay, so now that we are done, now let's inside our try catch block, let's just get rid of everything inside there. So we need to catch an error there. Okay, so let's create a try catch block. And then, so what we're basically going to do is let's create a stream response, which we are going to just await our request, right? Or request, then we are simply just going to send that request. And then we are going to get a response from our stream response, right? So to get a response, what we're simply going to do is I'm going to use await, and then I'm going to say http dot response dot stream. Okay, and then now we can just put in the stream response. Okay, all right, so now what we can do is we can get our data, which we are going to just get from decoding our response report. Okay, so now basically now what we are going to just do is we are going to check if our response status code is code 200. That means that we have a successful response, right? So if we have a successful response, what we are simply going to do is we are just going to return right with success, right? The success response, and then the message is going to be data, which we are going to get from our backend. The message, for example, the message is going to be user data updated successfully, right? And then else, so that means that if we don't have a successful response, what we're simply going to do is 10 left, and then a failure, right? And then we are simply going to write data, and then message, right? All right, so now what we are simply going to do now, we are simply going to return left, and then we are going to just display the message if there is a failure, right? Which is going to be error to string, right? Okay, so now that we are done, so now that we are done working with our repository, now what we simply need to do is we simply need to create our user repository provider, right? It's going to be provider, and then reference, we are simply going to return our user repository, right? And then for our user repository, what we're simply going to do is we're simply going to watch the local auth repository provider, and we are also going to watch our HTTP client. So it's going to be HTTP provider. Okay, so now we are done with working with our user repository. Now it's time we move on to our user controller, right? So let's move on to our user controller, right? So let's create a file user controller. So user underscore controller dot. So our class is going to be user controller, which is going to just extend sync notifier. And then we're simply going to return async value, and then void. Then what we simply have to do here is we simply have to import Flutter port, right? And then so our class is going to depend on our user repository. It's going to be underscore user repository. Okay. So now let's create an override function, an override build function, right? So just think of it as our build function is just an init. It's like an init method, right? Init state method, but for our async notifier, right? So it is fired when we run the user control class. That's the first method that's run, right? Our build method. So if we need to do anything that needs to be initialized, we can just initialize it. For example, here, since our class depends on our user repository, we're simply going to watch for our user repository. Right, we're simply going to watch for our user repository provider. Simply going to return an async value, and the data is going to be null. Okay, right. So it's not supposed to be async void, it's supposed to be async value. All right, so now that we are done, now let's work on our method for getting our user data. So it's going to be method future type user mode. So we are going to get the user data by the user ID. And async method. Then the response is going to be reach user repository dot get user data. Then we are going to simply pass in the user ID. Then what is we are simply going to use a switched statement to work on our response. So basically what we are simply going to do is, if we are getting left method, that means if we have any errors, we are simply going to throw that error. say throw L, then write what we're simply going to do, value right now. Then what we're simply going to do, we're simply going to return. Yeah, okay. All right, so what we have to do, let's just import our user model right there. Okay, now what we simply have to do now is let's just wait update user date. It's going to be future of type void, and then the function is we're going to name it update user data. Sync. Then profile image. So username, first name, last name, and then I'll also need the user ID. And then we'll also need a build context, right? So build text, then context. Okay, so let's import material that build context. All right, so let's import .io. All right, so basically what we are simply going to do here is let's create a response, which is going to, we are simply going to await user repository dot date user data. So the profile, username, and then let's change this to caps lock I, so user ID, right? Then what you're simply going to do is just create a variable switch statement, right? So that's that one is obviously that it allows us to just use a switch statement, and then we can check here if we have, like, if our response is successful, then we can simply show a snake. We can simply show a snake bar, and then with message profile updated, or we can just do toString. toString, right? And then if there is an error, what we simply do here is we'll simply change this to L, and then it's going to be L.toString, right, in case there's an error. All right. So something is wrong with the switch statement. Okay, it's supposed to be left. Right. So now we are done with our user controller. So now let's create our user controller provider. The controller. Then taking user controller. Then within async value type void. Then what is simply return controller. Okay, so what we're simply going to do is we just need to get user data provider. So we are going to use a feature provider, and then dot family. We're going to use the family since we have an argument, right? So taking reference and then string a user ID. And then we'll chain reference dot read, and then we're simply, so let's just use reference dot watch. We are going to watch user controller provider dot notify, and then we are simply going to get our user did. Okay. All right, so now that we are completely done with our user controller, so it's time for us to create our profile screen, right? So let's go inside our screens, and then let's create the file profile screen dot, then it's going to be a stateful widget, then we're simply going to change it to profile screen. Okay, right. So basically what we have to do here is let's change to consumer stateful widget, since we are consuming Liverpool providers, then consumer state, and also consumer state here. Right, so basically what we simply do here is let's import Flutter Liverpool. Okay, so what we are simply going to do here is let's get the user ID, which is equal to reference to watch, and then local auth repository provider, and then dot get user ID, right? So get the user ID, then let's get the user data. So user data is equal to reference dot watch, then get user data provider. Then we are going to simply pass the user ID to string. All right. So basically now what we simply have to do here is simply have to return a scaffold widget. So with our scaffold widget, what we need is an app bar. So inside our app bar, we also need the actions, action theme, theme dot context, and then dot icon theme. Okay. All right. So and then we have actions where we can include buttons, so forth. So for action, we simply going to have a text, and then that text is going to be edit. Then style that text style, and then the color, is going to be, and also a font weight, it's going to be font weight dot bold, and font size 18. Okay, and then let's wrap it with a pairing widget. Okay, so now that we have wrapped it with the padding widget, now what we need is a title, right? So also need a title. Also need a title, right? So the title is going to be a text, and then that text is going to be my profile. So let's take it. So give it a color of black, and then so also give it a font weight. So give it a font weight of 18. Okay, so this is font weight is supposed to be font weight dot bold. Font size is close to 18. All right. And then body. So use the data when data. And then we also have an error. Error, then a state trace. So what we'll simply do is we'll simply return an error text. And then as a toString, and then loading. Then we'll simply display a circular context indicator. So let's wrap it with a constant widget here, but let's just leave it like that. Okay. So here, what we're simply going to do, we are going to just return a safe area widget, right? So the child is going to be a single child store view. Then the child is simply going to be a column widget with children, right? So basically what we are simply going to do here, the children will simply give it a spacing of 20. Right, so what we simply have to do now is we're going to profile image is not equal to, and then we're going to return circle avatar, then background color, it's equals to colors.white. All right, and then we have a radius of 40. And then also need a background image, so it's going to be a network image. URL is going to be data profile, full profile image path .string. Okay, and then let's just copy, and then else what we're simply going to do is we're simply going to return an asset image. Then it's going to be assets. So let's check inside our assets folder, and then images, and then /. send.png. Okay. And then after this, now what we need is it's just a raw widget. And then we need a space between those children. So we'll use main axis alignment dot space between. Okay. And then the first one is a text. And then the text is going to be first name. Style, and then text style. And the color is going to be black. Font size is going to be 17. Then we also have font weight. Then font weight bold. Okay. All right, so let's just copy the same text here. And then let's just paste it. And then we'll change it from first name to data dot first name dot toString. All right, so then we change the font size to 15, and then font weight to W500. Right, so what we basically will do here is let's just copy the same raw widget. So this raw widget, let's just repeat with the padding widget. And then what we simply have to do here is let's just copy it, and then let's paste it below. Right. So we'll change this from first name to last name. Okay, and then last name, and then also username. Username. Okay. And then yeah, so that's basically it for our profile. So what we'll simply do is let's go back to our settings screen. So let's go to settings, screen, settings, and then okay, first of all, let's go back to our utils folder, and then route, and then let's just copy this route here. Then let's just paste it here, and then let's change it to profile screen. Let's just change this to profile, and then let's update it inside our .dat file. So let's just copy. And then we are simply going to change to profile screen. And then also, yeah. Right. So now that we're done, let's go back to now our settings screen. So what we want to do here is we have this center widget with a stack widget. So what we're simply going to do is this stack widget container. What we simply do is let's just wrap this stack widget with a gesture detector. And once when the user clicks on the profile icon, we want to update them. the profile script. So it's going to be navigator dot push named. So it's going to be about. Right. So let's just copy this. Get a push named, and then let's go to our my profile, and then let's repeat with the case state. Then on tap right. So now that we are done, what I'll simply do is I'm simply going to test our application on our emulator. Then we are simply going to test and see if everything is working. Right. So let me just move my IDE there. Then pull our emulator, and then let's see. Okay, guys, so the reason why we're getting this error was because initially when the user creates their profile, they don't upload a profile image by default. So that means that the endpoint doesn't contain /API/users and then the user ID, right? At first. So we need to make sure that we check if the profile image URL, that is the URL of the image, if that URL contains /API users. So if it contains, that means that we have an image, right? We have an image that the user has uploaded to our backend, right? Otherwise, that means that the user doesn't have a profile picture. So we just display this default circle avatar, right, with the image asset, right? So thanks for watching, guys. Cheers.